Were cantrips a design mistake for D&D? So a little bit about just the basic history about cantrips. So cantrips kind of jumped out on the scene in a Dragon magazine article for first edition AD&D, written by none other than Gary Gygax himself, and kind of explained most of the sort of utility of them as what we would kind of probably mostly consolidate today into things like prestidigitation or thaumaturgy, very simple sort of parlor trick kind of effects. And then cantrips kind of went away outside of the Dragon article, didn't really resurface again until after WoTC picked up the D&D license, picked up the D&D brand, and came out with their third edition of the game, in which it was native right there, straight in the book. It's been 20 odd years now, and we still have them, and I think you can see that their cantrips have really grown from this original idea of a little tiny sort of utility magic, almost could be confused for sleight of hand, to now we have cantrips that scale and become more powerful than leveled spells. And so now as we move into sort of D&D 2024, and now I've played a few games of it both as a player and as DM, and trying to consider, are cantrips a mistake? And really it has been this new sort of version of the game coming out and sort of testing that and kind of putting it through its paces and learning more about the system, that I kind of came to an idea that maybe cantrips were a design mistake. And I want to talk a little bit more about that. Primarily sort of my gripes that I've seen sort of as this sort of evolution of cantrips, and how I think it's actually kind of hurting the game in general in the direction that it's sort of trending, and wondering if I'm alone in this. See if you guys feel the same way. Obviously leave comments about that below. I am interested to see, what maybe future editions of the game would look like, or even what maybe the current edition of the game would look like if we played a game that we just pulled the cantrips out of, or severely limited or modded them with some homebrewery to make them not have the same sort of issues that we're about to talk about. So rather than a lot more preamble, we keep talking about were cantrips a design mistake for D&D. Let's just go ahead and sort of jump into that. So of course, if this is the first time to your channel, thanks for hanging out. We're going to go through this. We're going to talk a little bit about it. If you like this sort of content, we've got more of it on the channel. We also do a solo adventure playthrough with the 5e rules, which is really interesting. If you're looking for other things, more in-depth things than we cover in sort of these videos, there's always the website, reddragonfiend.com, that has years and years of blogs on it that you can kind of go see. So the channel, relatively new, the blog, relatively old at this point. So one of the first sort of design issues I feel like we have with cantrips is that they're too accessible, and this is especially damning sort of in the new 2024 version, or update of the rules, whatever you want to call it, is that now they're just really too accessible. They're almost universally acceptable. Sort of every PC, regardless of sort of ancestry and class, can gain cantrips at level 1 through either their ancestry or a background choice that grants sort of the magic initiate feat. There is this tendency that you can just end up with cantrips even if you don't necessarily want them, or you're not really kind of going out of your way to get them. You might end up with them regardless. And the weird thing is especially with the magic initiate one, you get the sort of flexibility to choose the spell list that you want to use and the casting ability, which makes these abilities sort of like overly flexible. I mean, there's a design principle here that assumes that's very nice. That's like, if you're going to get access to this, you're probably going to have some sort of appropriate ability modifier that you're going to have at least some sort of bonus in that you might be able to use. But that comes at sort of the expense of they're very easy to access and everybody's going to be good with them. And we'll see why that's a little bit more of an issue as we get into some of the other points, but it's just so easy to get access to them that every player character now, I feel like, especially with the 2024 rewrites, that anytime that I am playing or running for a group of players, it's more likely that most of the group, even the martial classes, are going to have access to some sort of minor magics like cantrips that do things. I think there's also, because they made it so flexible. There's this low ability score dependency. There's even a lot of cantrips that don't rely on ability score at all. You know, your standard sort of utility ones where there's no sort of casting involved. Light is always going to be useful for a character to take regardless of who that character is. Even if you have dark vision, if you're following sort of the rules as written or as they're at least intended, dark vision doesn't just mean you have 1000% night vision sort of heat sight. Basically what it means is that you have eyes that are more akin to something like a cat or an owl or something like that, where you have the ability to see in low light situations as if it was sort of normal daylight situations. This is something that's actually kind of pulled out of older editions. There used to be sort of 3 sets of light for vision. It used to be sort of like normal and dim light and then dark vision. And starting with 5th edition, they kind of pulled that dim vision out, that dim light vision out, and then dark vision is just kind of dim light vision now, which is interesting. But it's very, very clear that like you just cannot see in 100% pitch darkness. It's something to keep in mind with sort of these cantrips, is that you also have access to something that immediately ensures that you're never going to have to deal with torches going out or running out of oil, all these sort of basic low-level exploration challenges that just kind of get pushed to the side because of it. And adding ability score increases to backgrounds as a fix in 2024 for mismatched builds feels like a band-aid rather than addressing the deeper design issues. Because basically what they've done is when they tie that magic initiate feat to a background, and that background has very specific ability score increases that you can use, that was their sort of band-aid that would keep people from not choosing magic initiate just right off bat. But when it comes to only a +1 or a +2 on something right early on the build, it's like I could have a 17th strength or a 16th strength, which functionally through the modifier is exactly the same when I'm building my character, or I could get access to 2 cantrips that would really help me. It's actually not much of a trade-off. At least in my mind, it feels like a 2 wrongs don't make a right sort of situation. Let me just give you an example. Ignoring sort of background locked ability score increases. So in Touchless Cauldron and everything, we basically took ability score increases and we got rid of them for ancestries. We just removed that out. If you want to play an elf barbarian, that's a perfectly reasonable build because now the ability score increases aren't tied to, you know, elf. But then we turned around in 2024 and added them back in, and that feels incredibly regressive to sort of lock them in again to another very specific choice about your character. And I think they did that to sort of, number one, to sort of even out the magic initiate cantrip access, and also to kind of make backgrounds a little bit more important, because I feel like in 5e the features were cool, they were very flavorful, but they didn't get a lot of use at the table. If you were something like an acolyte and you're like, oh well, any town we go to I can stay at the temple without paying any rent, and it's like, that's cool, but that's not really a concern after maybe 2nd level. Like, being able to afford lodging's not really that big of a deal, and it's really not worth it to go through the interaction to do that unless there's some sort of story reason that you need to access a temple or a church or whatever it is. The second issue that I kind of have with the sort of modern cantrip design is that there are too many options. There's a proliferation of cantrips in general. There are 34 in the new 2024 Player's Handbook alone. So it's about 5.5 cantrips per base class with cantrips. Not taking into consideration characters that get access to cantrips through their ancestry, through those background features, but just classes that I'm a full caster class and I get cantrips as part of my class. Each of those classes gets roughly 5.5 cantrips per base class. That's a lot of cantrips to choose from. And that adds to this idea that there's this unintentional sort of accumulation that PCs can end up with numerous amounts of cantrips from various different sources, from their ancestry, from their background, from their class, through, you know, potentially feats and other things. You can end up with a bunch of cantrips without really trying for it. So, as an example, I was building a cleric for a one-shot, and I ended up with, it was either 7 or 9 cantrips just right out right out of the box. Just because I was like, well, I'm going to choose a cool ancestry that feels fun. Oh, that gives me a cantrip. Oh, well, I'm going to choose the Acolyte background because that makes the most sense for this character. He's just a dyed-in-the-wool cleric. Oh, that also gives me cantrips. And then I'm a caster, and that also gives me cantrips. Wow, I have a bunch of cantrips. And that becomes actually, for me, especially in a one-shot situation, I was running out of cantrips I even wanted to take for that character. And then just playing them at the table, being like, all right, in any situation, do I have a cantrip that works for this? Because I have a whole bunch. I have combat ones, I have utility ones, I have social situation ones, like friends and things like that. So it kind of made me this super Swiss Army knife, but at the same time made me feel, even as a relatively low level character, I think we're playing level 4 or level 5, somewhere in there, and felt like, wow, this character is incredibly powerful for low level, especially with knowing all these cantrips are going to scale at 5th level. All those combat ones are going to scale for sure. And that kind of leads me into the next point, is that most of these cantrips, of the 34, 65% are combat focused. I think there's way too much sort of combat overload for the cantrips. While many of the sort of abilities and resources in D&D are combat oriented, for sure, right? It falls pretty much in line that 65% falls about where combat takes up about 2/3 of the game rules. So that part feels right. But by doing that, by having this many cantrips focused on combat and the way that they scale, it has this ability to exacerbate the martial versus caster imbalance that D&D has, well, always had, where you hear the old linear martials, quadratic wizards kind of argument. Except with cantrips, it's now not as quadratic for the wizards, for your spellcasters, where they're like underpowered, then they start getting access to higher level spells, and now they're incredibly powerful, versus that sort of straight and narrow martial kind of grade. Now you just have spellcasters that start out on that martial track and then just get more powerful. It's just, rather than having that sort of 45-degree curve, it's a much steeper incline on that curve, and they're just always going to be more powerful. And I feel like we see that. I feel like I see that every time that I have a party that hits level 5, and you see that boost, and then playing a caster character, I hit level 5, and I'm like, oh, now all these first level combat spells are kind of worthless for the most part, because now I have cantrips that do relatively similar damage. They don't cost me anything, so now I have to retool all my first level spells to be like more utility stuff that I normally wasn't picking up, because they were my higher level damage spells. But as you progress in power, you have to redo all the spells again and again, and it does make things more complicated, a little bit more tedious for caster sort of spell management. Obviously, one of the biggest problems I feel like there is in cantrips by design is this infinite resource power. Having these scaling damage cantrips effectively gives casters a martial equivalent attack, but with the added versatility of also I have higher level, very powerful spells that do very weird and different things, then I just hit it and do damage with the attack. They also do a number of other things that kind of set them apart. So again, you have cantrips that are basically the same as martial attacks. As martial characters get extra attack, cantrips go up in power, so they stay on par with each other. So then you have martials and casters on par, but casters also have this entire library of powerful spell effects behind them that they get to use that martials don't have. They have very specific sort of abilities and things that they can do, but I think it's hard to argue something like Second Wind is as useful as something like a Cure Wounds or a Healing Word spell. Like, those things are not the same. And so the trade-off for that was obviously casters have this limited resource of spell slot pools that they can use to do these effects. But then when you add cantrips into that mix, that is removed away. The other big thing that cantrips do is that they circumvent a lot of common resistances that monsters have. Cantrips offer damage types that bypass resistances or immunities, especially to the bludgeoning, slashing, piercing trio that is the majority of martial output. And they're able to do that without requiring magic items. We're looking at things that have been changed in 2024, like Shillelagh and True Strike, that now not only make it easier for casters to actually just do melee attacks straight up, as good or better than martial characters, they also get to change the damage type from bludgeoning, slashing, piercing with non-magical weapons to do force or radiant damage types that most characters are not resistant to or immune to. In fact, and a lot are in fact vulnerable to. If you're playing a caster, it's great. If you're playing a martial character, though, especially in 2024, you kind of feel kind of left behind in the dust, and that's weird. Usually in a new edition, you're trying to find a way to balance martial's reliability against caster's raw power. But it seems that in sort of 2024, they were like, well, we'll just give everybody spells and it'll be fine. Which is actually one thing that people disliked about something like 4th edition, where it felt like all the characters were the same. They had all access to the same thing. But it does follow in step with sort of the 5th edition, when every sort of martial class has a subclass that also does magic, at least one that does magic. Or you kind of get into this idea then 4th and 5th edition, and if we're continuing along this trend, that modern D&D will just be like basically all magic casters all the time, just sometimes they hold weapons and wear armor. Which I'm not sure is really this legacy or spirit of what I think most people think of when they think of D&D. Outside of just sort of the resistances and the ability to do basically the same thing that martials do with attacks, they also have a lot of overpowered utilities, those ribbons that kind of come with the damage. So you have things that, in addition to doing a damage type that a lot of creatures are not resistant to or immune to, compared to bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing, you also have cantrips that reduce speed, they impose disadvantage, they force movement, they remove monstrous reactions, they disrupt spells. For example, Starry Wisp deals damage and can negate a second level invisibility spell with basically no resource cost for a round, because it makes them light up and glow. Starry Wisp is a cantrip that does damage, does a very powerful type of damage that most creatures are not resistant to, and in addition to that, also makes it extremely difficult for stealthy or invisible monsters to do their things. And you compare that next to, I hit it with my sword, and I have trouble hitting it with my sword, because it's invisible. You see that these things are just, they're not, we're not even talking about just sort of like equitable balance. These are things that are like not at all balanced. We see that there's this poor martial counterbalancing that they've tried to do with 2024 with the weapon masteries, which is, I have a different campaign that I play in that we use the revised martial equipment, which is sort of 2024's weapon masteries, but on steroids. They're really juiced up for good and for bad. For good, because it makes martial characters much more powerful and allows them to do things that spellcasters really can't do for the most part. But the downside is that it does make the combat, being a martial character, extremely more complicated. There are all these other additional things. The group that I play with, we basically all have flowchart diagrams about like when do we do which things based off of what we do, because the weapon masteries change the weapon properties, which allow you to do very specific things, which are kind of tied to setting up particular situations. It's very crunchy. It very much dives towards the crunchy complexity that you're going to see something in the game that's more like Pathfinder, either 1st or 2nd edition. Kind of jumps back towards, in a regression towards that sort of 3.5 mechanically complex, lots of little floating modifiers kind of game style, which I'm not a super huge fan of. But I do like that it does make martial characters feel, maybe not one-to-one with spellcasters, but feel like they also have cool things they can do in combat other than I hit it with my sword. And so in 2024, we see these weapon masteries come in, but they're lackluster. They're kind of an anemic response to this, especially with the glow up, the just vastly more powerful most cantrips are in 2024. You have weapon effects that are constrained by your class abilities that you have, by the weapon type that you choose, which kind of limits your flexibility to choosing weapons, which is supposed to be one of the big things that fighters get to do, is they have versatility to fight with all armors and weapons. But the truth is that all the feats and everything that's built towards that, you're never rewarded for that versatility, for that generalization. It's always better, and basically any D20 game, to specialize, to focus on doing one thing well. And so you're like, well, if I only do long swords, then I only have access to longsword weapon masteries. So that makes all the other weapon masteries not useful for me. And you're like, cool, but you could also switch weapons in combat. Yes, that is true, but switching weapons in combat, especially mid-combat, is limited by the action economy, whereas casters don't have to do any sort of item interaction or sheathing or unsheathing to use their cantrips. So you have, let's say a paladin who's got a longsword, some javelin, and I don't know, maybe they have an offhand, maybe they have like a dagger or something like that. They can switch between all those weapons, but each one requires them as an object interaction to be like, okay, I'm going to sheath my sword as an object interaction, and then I will draw and throw the javelin as an attack action. It's like, so that already in the action economy space uses that free item interaction, so I can't now quaff a potion at the same time. But a caster can be like, I'm choosing to use one of my 5 cantrips. There's no action economy that's involved with me having to like load in or out a specific cantrip. I can use that cantrip to do an attack roll, and then I can still use my item interaction to quaff a potion if I want to. So even when we get down to the action economy levels, they don't mash up correctly. Other things that they do, the last one is world-breaking utility ones, talking about sort of the overpowered non-combat cantrips. So there are 12 non-combat cantrips in 2024. You have things like Guidance, which makes spellcasters superior in ability checks, especially at higher levels, often with no consequences for spamming it. If you have something that lasts for a minute and you can do it every 6 seconds, there's no reason. We went through this through the entire lifespan of 5e. If you have Guidance, you should basically be throwing out it every time somebody picks up a die to roll it. You're going to make an acrobatic check, here, have some Guidance. Sort of like the help action, so you get to a position where people have the help action and Guidance for most checks, which gives them the ability to just really rocket over most normal DCs. So in addition to this Guidance, of course, you have Prestidigitation, Mending, Light. These all perform actions that either mundane individuals or mundane items accomplish in the world, while bypassing the resource cost of both those things. And that is probably, for me, one of my biggest gripes. You try to imagine a world in which mending exists and be like, okay, you can mend any 1 foot tear or rip or gash or whatever it is in 60 seconds. And you wonder, it's like, okay, what about all the people whose sort of like daily jobs are to repair things? Things like carpenters, masons, those sorts of people, skilled tradespeople, and like, what is the impact that having a low-level wizard, and again, if we're using sort of like the D&D generic campaign setting, is that there are a lot of wizards in it. So how can you justify having these very sort of intensive, trained artisans who also need to buy resources to make these repairs when you have somebody who can just snap their finger and repair that? It kind of destroys that a lot of the economy and doesn't really make sense. Because mending not only just fixes the thing, it actually makes it appear as if the damage was never there. So I talked about this with some friends. Is like, you could make an entire character who's a first level wizard or any sort of caster who gets access to mending. It's like, oh well, every day I get up in the morning and I walk to our sort of our cesspit, our sort of midden pile, our dump, and then I just find broken things and I cast mending on them, and I spend my whole morning doing that. I walk back to the market, and then I just sell the things again as if they're new, because through the power of mending, they are essentially just brand new, as though they had not taken any damage at all. And I was like, you could have a very successful career just doing that and make a lot of money because it bypasses any resource cost to you other than just a little bit of that your wizard's time. I find that very worrying. Just the same way that there are things like light as a spell or dancing lights, but also you can just have torches and lanterns, and there are magical light sources, like magic item light sources, like drift globes and ever burning torches, but you have those as well. So then when you have those cantrips that can so easily do that and they're not concentration, you're like, well, these magic items are now kind of useless. I can't tell you the number of campaigns that I've gotten something like a drift globe in and been like, okay, well, this is kind of useless. There's two casters in the party that have light. It's neat, but I'm not going to use an attunement. I'm pretty sure it takes an attunement slot. I'm not going to use an attunement slot for something that I can do as a basic cantrip. So you see sort of that trade-off, how very utility magic items just not very useful. And that's a lot of griping about cantrips and sort of cantrip design. So how could we maybe like improve cantrips? What would we do to sort of course correct what I feel like the trend is kind of deviating for in D&D? That's hard to say because balancing cantrips is hard. It's hard to balance something that's got no resource cost kind of tied to it. Some cantrips like Blade Ward, which is sort of the base 5e True Strike, that are essentially sort of useless cantrips. Like Blade Ward's nice, but are you really going to take a cantrip that you have to use an entire action on your turn to make sure somebody takes 1d4 less damage from a very specific type of energy? That's not really a great trade-off for my one sort of action in combat in a turn. But then on the other side, you have in 2024 things like we talked about, Shillelagh and True Strike that are incredibly more powerful and actually make certain builds kind of redundant, because Shillelagh and True Strike are just base level, just better than martial attacks. Even once martial characters get 5th level and get 2 attacks, things like True Strike and Shillelagh continue to upgrade. Shillelagh's not so bad. True Strike's pretty bad though, because you're like, oh, you get to do all your weapon damage as usual, plus an extra d6, and you can decide whether you want that to be radiant damage or not. That's still very, very powerful, even up into the second tier of sort of levels of D&D. Whereas Shillelagh, I think, just increases the dice size. Doing that and having the ability to use those when using an ability score that is not, specifically not strength, but also not dexterity, makes certain builds kind of redundant if you can get access to that. So there's really no reason when you have something like True Strike, do something like a basic paladin build that's a basic strength-based paladin. So you could do a dexterity-based paladin. I mean, the only thing you would need strength for as a paladin at that point would be your armor requirements, maybe. So if you went a dex-based paladin, you wouldn't need that. You could just rely on the dex for things like AC and have a better dexterity saving throw, because strength saving throws almost never come up. By doing that, it makes these other types of builds just less useful or kind of redundant. Like, you can have now a war cleric who doesn't really need any strength because they can use True Strike to use their wisdom to make melee attacks. It's an issue. Balancing those cantrips is really, really difficult. I think the best way to sort of illustrate how that balancing might work, let's rework a cantrip. I think that's the easiest way to do that. Let me look at the list of cantrips real quick and let's pick one. Yeah, I was just griping about it, so let's do mending. Why not? So we're gonna look at the mending spell a little bit. So mending, transmutation cantrip, casting time 1 minute. We talked about that. So it takes 60 seconds, so it's not something you can do in combat really. Range is touch, that's not really an issue. Requires verbal, somatic, and material components. Those components are 2 lodestones or of course an arcane focus. Duration, instantaneous. The spell repairs a single break or tear in an object you touch, such as a broken chain link, 2 halves of a broken key, a torn cloak, or a leaking wineskin. As long as the break or tear is no longer than 1 foot in any dimension, you mend it, leaving no trace of the former damage. So I talked about how you could just be a wizard who goes to the dump and just picks up like broken pots and jars and torn clothes and just remake them and sell them again as brand new. Especially if you couple that with prestidigitation, where it just automatically cleans things too and makes them smell fresh, give it that new car smell. It makes it very easy to make a lot of money very, very quickly without a lot of work. And it does make you think, why would anybody who has access to these spells ever go adventuring? when they could so easily make a life for themselves just doing that. Spell can physically repair a magic item but can't restore magic to such an item. That's basically the limitation of mending, is the physical size of which you have to work with, and that it doesn't restore magic to a magic item. So obviously there's a bunch of sort of like issues that I find with mending. It trivializes repairs. It bypasses things like tool proficiencies that would be useful in this sort of situation that we rarely get to see examples of use of in play. Imagine that the party is going through the wilderness and they come across a boat that's been sort of pulled up on shore. It's clearly been left out for a while, and it does have a, let's say, a hole in it. You could repair the boat, which is an effortless task for a character with mending, who can just be like, oh, there's a hole in the boat. Now there's not a hole in the boat. Now we can turn it over and use this boat. Free boat. In doing so, it does sideline those player characters with relevant tool proficiencies, or proficiencies like, I mean, you could have water vehicle proficiency, or have the shipwright background, which I think just gives you carpentry. I think it's carpentry tools. So having those two things, characters with those proficiencies would be able to make checks to do the repairs on it, but they would also need to, find some materials to do as a resource to fix that. It's going to take a hell of a lot more time than 1 minute to fix even a basic hole in the boat. And all that stuff's just kind of pushed to the side because a wizard has this one specific spell that's really only useful for this. And I'll be honest, for as much as I'm complaining about mending doesn't come up that often in campaigns, but it could. You could have a lot more things in your campaign that were, here is a simple thing that you could do, but the thing you need to do it is broken, so you need to fix that thing. That's a pretty common, especially along with what I call sort of the hiccup method. Like, hey, we need to get from X place to Y destination. Hiccup, what's the hiccup? What's the issue that's in the middle? Oh, the bridge is out. Okay, well, we gotta find somebody to fix the bridge or figure out a way across the river. Maybe we can find a board somewhere up or down. Maybe we can find somebody with a boat who can take us across. Maybe there's a ferry somewhere a few miles down or upriver. And you have all these sorts of things, but then you have situations where it's like, oh, well, they could just be fixed by the wizard with mending. Especially like something like that, because 1 cubic foot is a large area to fix. That means that you can basically fix old foundational, like wooden posts too. Things that are like 1 foot in diameter. If it's been snapped in half from weight because the ceiling collapsed, you could legitimately just fix that with a cantrip. And that, again, is really overpowered, I feel like. And I have these issues with a lot of the cantrips, which is mending is the one we decided to focus on. Let's look at some proposed changes. So what would I change to sort of deal with these issues? The first thing I would do is probably increase the casting time. 1 minute, I feel like, is too short. I would probably change it from 1 minute to 10 minutes. So that way, if we're going to stop to do this, we should at least be doing some sort of like wandering monster random encounter roll as sort of a limitation of using the spell. You're going to sit here to deal with this, there's a chance some monsters are going to run across you. That feels pretty safe to me. If I was going to not change anything else, I would probably bump that up even more to even something like an hour to make it align a little bit more, like I said, with those mundane repairs. It's like, for a small repair, you could probably do a lot of small repairs within an hour, assuming you had the materials to do that. So then, if you have the mending, you can at least offset the time balance a little bit. Like, oh, well, it'll take an hour for this person to put a plug into the boat, or it takes an hour for the person casting mending to do that. That seems like it's a little bit more balanced to me, but I want to focus more on sort of that 10 minutes. So try to focus on what we can do with mending to still make it a powerful and useful spell without being like, well, if you took any tool proficiencies, that was really stupid, because those aren't going to be useful. When we change, okay, so we're going to up the time a little bit. We're going to go from 1 minute to 10 minutes. So that way we can at least, if you choose to do this, you're going to have somebody who's going to come in and be like, all right, well, maybe there's a monster that's going to attack, or maybe something's going to happen if you guys are going to just stop in the middle of adventure to do this. The next thing I would do is probably add a material cost. So we kind of said with the mundane repairs, you were going to have to source materials. If you found this boat in the middle of the wilderness, it might be just spending some time trying to find an appropriate piece of wood, or getting some sap out of a tree, making some sort of like glue, waterproofing material, things like that to to repair this boat, or you could just buy those materials if you were in something like a city. So I think it makes sense if you're not going to have to go out and source the repair materials to make the repairs with mending, because that's not really what the spell does. There should introduce some sort of minor material cost. Of course, the 5e and 2024 rules for spells is that if there is a coin amount listed with the material cost, you do actually have to provide that item. That can't be hand waved away with just by using your arcane focus or components pouch. So I think introducing a material cost, let's say like 10 gold's worth of gemstone dust, that sounds pretty reasonable to me. I think that makes a sort of tangible resource expense and gives, I feel like those treasure, especially in low levels when you get a whole bunch of just like 10 GP, 20 GP, 50 GP gemstones that are just like, hey, here's the thing I also just convert into cash that doesn't serve any other purpose in the game. So if we did that and we had like a functional use for those small gemstones, I think that could actually be really interesting to have characters be excited about being like, oh yeah, I got a 10 gold piece worth of amethyst. That's going to be super useful for us when we need the mending spell lately. I'm going to hold on to that and grind that down into gemstone dust. I like that sort of stuff when somebody gets excited, especially parties that get excited about getting sort of mundane stuff, being like, oh, this is actually going to be very useful for us. We really wanted this. We're going to tie some material costs for that. And I think that should scale too. I think the cantrip's going to scale, but let me get through the things before we start talking about scaling it. So I think we're going to increase the casting time to 10 minutes. We're going to add this sort of small material cost. 10 gold is maybe a lot for a first level party, but by the time you're 3rd or 4th level, that's not much. Right? It makes sense that you carry around a pocket full of gemstone dust to use specifically for this. I think that another good thing that would be used to kind of separate it apart from those people that have the tool proficiencies is to make the repairs temporary. Let's remove this sort of minor magical cantrip that allows you to just permanently fix things. This is more of a patch job. This is a mend job, not a fix job. Not a completely make it again like new kind of thing. So we're gonna pull that part out of mending. The part where it says it leaves no trace of former damage is like, nope, it's just a mend. You can clearly tell it was damaged before. You can clearly tell that we have used magic to replace the missing parts or re-weld together the broken pieces, but it's very clearly mended. It's not perfect again. And that this repair duration, let's say, goes 24 hours. You get a day out of it. And I think that if you do that, then it still makes sense to have mending and people with proficiencies in the same campaign world. So you have mending for somebody who's like, hey, we need to fix this thing, we've got to fix it relatively quickly. I'm going to use 10 GP of gemstone dust in 10 minutes, and we're going to get this build going. And tomorrow, or whenever we get back to camp, maybe you can spend a little bit more time permanently fixing it, but we can use it right now and not have to sit around and worry about that. So that's the trade-off. Mending gets you to do something faster, and it's a temporary solution, but if you were going to do full repairs, it would be a longer process, but those repairs would be permanent. So I think that's an equitable balance, right? It's not equal, but it is equitable. Do you want something fast but temporary for a cost, or do you want something permanent but it's going to take some time? I think that makes sense to me. Increasing the casting time, we're going to add a little bit of material cost to it, and we're going to change it from being a permanent fix to a temporary fix. And then I think we should introduce scaling, because I think that's one of the things that I like about cantrips. Or I should say that I like the idea of scaling spells. This is something that I like that DCC does well, that First Edition Starfinder does well, where you have spells that you get at low levels, and then as you get more powerful, those spells become more powerful. So there's less choice of spells, but those spells become more powerful as your character becomes more powerful. They reflect the increased power of your character. So instead of having like things there's like healing word and then there's like mass healing word, like those would just all be one spell, and you could just cast it at a higher level once you had the ability to do so, to choose basically more targets, area effect, do more healing, that sort of thing. In the same way, you could look at something like Firebolt scaling to Burning Hand, scaling to something like Flaming Sphere, scaling to something like Fireball. Scaling all the way up to, I don't know, what's a big high-end spell? Maybe something like, I think maybe Meteor Swarm does fire damage. And that would be sort of the high-end rail of if we went along sort of the I shoot things with fire path of spell scaling. So I want to introduce scaling because I like that mechanic, but I do think you have to. I don't like the way that sort of 5e and 2024 has done this thing where it's like, oh, well, you just get some more damage. And now it's better than maybe your first level spells. So now you have a bunch of worthless first level spells that you have to trade out or rewrite in your spell book, or it's kind of a mess. So let's talk about scaling. So how would I scale? So I kind of said that I want to use the gemstone levels. So I do know if you look in the D&D treasure packets that they do increase, and you see those gemstones sort of ratchet up. So I think that makes sense to ratchet up the price as characters will have more, the party will have more gold to sink into it, and we can change maybe the amount of repair to match that. Let's do it by tiers. There's 4 tiers to play. So first level tier, you spend 10 GP of gemstone dust, and let's say, what seems like an appropriate size? Let's say maybe something that's like fist or maybe like palm sized. For 10 gold pieces, you can fix 1 break or tear that's about that size. That sounds pretty good to me for a low level cantrip. And then, so that's levels 1 through 4. 5 through 10, you kind of jump up. And I think that's where we hit the standard sort of like 1 foot. And I think the next level of gemstone is 25. So it goes from 10 GP to 25 GP. It goes from basically this to this as to what you can repair. Then we're gonna open it up a little bit more. I think once you get to 11 and 16, there's a big jump there. It doubles up, I think 50 G is the next level up. So now you're talking about somebody's making the difference about whether do I buy a classic healing potion for 50 gold, or do I use this 50 GP of gemstone dust to cast mending. So I think if it's going to be that, you've got to do a larger size. So I think by the time you're in that 3rd tier, you're in levels 11 through 16, you're looking at things and you're like, all right, I think you can do a full medium-sized creature's square. So a 5 foot by 5 foot cube. I think that makes sense for 50 gold. I'd be like, oh, this entire sort of front side of this boat has been snapped in half, and you can put those 2 ends of the boat together and actually fix that entire boat. Again, it's only temporary. It'll only last for a day, but that's 50 GP to make a relatively sizable repair that will still last for 24 hours, and could still be fixed by mundane means if you wanted to. And then at the top level, once you hit sort of level 17 and plus, I'm saying you can do a full large size creature. You can do a 10 by 10 foot square. So that's a huge space. Mechanically, it's a large space, but descriptively, it's a huge space to repair something in. Be like, okay, for that 100 GP of gem dust. And this gives you the cool thing to be like, hey, there's a completely, I don't know, and I'd open it up a little bit more. Mending's like you can do like one break or tear. I'd probably be a little bit more flexible with that once you're spending like a material component attached to it. We already know that the way that we changed mending is that mending is going to show that this was clearly a mended item. It doesn't look like new, and it's temporary. And I think that people are savvy enough that you wouldn't be able to go and try to sell something that extremely expensive that you repaired with this. And you could be like, here, buy this, if you have 50 GP of gemstones, and you're like, hey, I just fixed this armor plate mail. Would you like to give me the full price for that, or the half price for it, or whatever it is, for the 50 G I spent to fix this? Somebody's going to look at it, and they're going to be able to look at the physical indication that this thing has been mended and be like, yeah, I know that's only going to last for 24 hours, so you can try to hawk this off on some idiot somewhere else. I think that's sort of the balancing act for it, to keep people from just like making ridiculous amounts of money off of something like this, while also relaxing a little bit. Like, it doesn't have to be like one singular tiny spare. Like, if you came to me with even the low level one, you're like, I want to fix something that's been shattered into like 15 pieces. I'm not going to make you have to cast, a dozen specific uses of the low level mending. If you do spending 120 gold to get this ink bottle or whatever back into its original shape, that's fine. I feel like that's very easy to be like, yeah, you spend the 10 gold and you reform. So there might be some clarifying language if I was going to write this out for homebrew. It'd be like, you can repair an item that costs up to this much that fits within that completely without multiple castings. Something like that. By the time you get to that sort of high level thing, you can be like, you can do a 10 by 10 foot cube to be like, I'm going to spend 100 GP in gemstone dust to completely fix this doorway, to completely fix the staircase, to overcome very specific things. Maybe you can fix like the water wheel in a water mill or something like that. Something that would be actually incredible amount of labor and skilled labor, time and effort to completely repair and permanently repair. Because remember, these are only temporary patch jobs. But you could do that. How I'm thinking about the impacts of rebalancing. I think that it encourages some creative problem solving. I can imagine a sort of second level party being able to find a broken plate mail armor set and feeling that we can basically rent a repaired version of this plate mail armor by maybe casting 2 or 3 of the low level mending spells on it. So from like 20 to 30 GP a day, they can afford for their fighter to have plate mail armor until they get back to town, and they can, have the armor smith completely repair it, make permanent repairs to it. But if it's done sort of in the middle of an adventure, in the middle of combat, a dungeon where they find this armor and they want to use it, that gives them a way to do that, while still, again, kind of getting money out of the economy, out of adventurers' pockets, which is always an issue, because the characters just end up with a bunch of gold and not anything to really spend it on. We can do some of these things at low level, being like, hey, this is kind of a repair tax until you actually spend the time and money and energy to get it permanently fixed. So it kind of just gives them more options, which is a good thing that spells do, is when they provide more options without completely overshadowing would be something else. So if you found this plate mail armor and you're fixing on it, but maybe every night you guys are in camp, or when you get back to town, you have somebody in the party who has blacksmith proficiency with blacksmith tools, and they're able to sort of go to the local smithy and kind of work on a little bit. So each adventure you guys go on as low level adventurers, you have to spend less and less of that sort of daily mending tax to make the plate mail useful until they get it completely fixed, which would be sort of like a fun dynamic sort of fighter wizard pair up to work on this project together, which I think could be a really fun experience for the players and for the party, and for dealing with seems like a relatively mundane problem in a very smart and magical way, which I think really kind of hits the sweet spot. At least for me, it kind of hits that sweet spot at D&D. It has a clear scaling tied to caster power and material costs. This rebalancing. It makes non-diamond gemstone valuable as adventuring loot, which they usually aren't. They're usually just like, hey, here's a different way that represents 50 gold coins. It highlights basically the tool proficiency is important in the world and useful for characters, and I think it encourages some creative problem solving for things like, hey, you want to use this really powerful item, maybe you guys find a very powerful magic wand or staff that's been broken. You can fix that. Now we know that it doesn't bring magic back, but it maybe gets to the point where it allows it to, maybe it can be re-enchanted, or maybe it has a really long recharge time where it's just sort of like ambiently filters in magic from the world to sort of like recharge up, something like that. If you want to give them something that maybe it takes a little bit of work for them to get sort of the full reward from. And I think that it expands sort of these narrative opportunities, especially as a dungeon master, where you can do things where you can do things like use rust monsters and not feel bad about them sort of taking away gear from your players, because they have a way to fix that. So you could use that mending to overcome the degradation in a semi-permanent way, and then you have sort of permanent repairs that get done to those items, things like that. But it does give some versatility and some new narrative opportunities for dungeon masters, where you can do things like break gear for players, or challenge players to think beyond hit point loss about things that they need to worry about in a combat. It's not like, oh, I'm not only going to attack your actual hit points, but I'm also going to really screw up your gear, or maybe throw your gear away or break it or whatever. And now having a framework to be like, okay, here's how we deal with stuff like that. And still making it a manageable challenge for your players, instead of just being like, oh, well, broke your sword, now you don't have a sword. Until you get back to town to buy a new one or take one off an enemy or whatever. Now it gives you an opportunity to be like, oh, well, we can fix the sword, but I got to do this temporary fix every day until we find another sword, or we can get you to a weaponsmith or messer, or whoever it is. That's sort of my take specifically on it, on cantrips, and the direction I see them going, and maybe how I would change things to maybe reorient what that is, because I think we're rocketing off on a path between starting with sort of 3rd edition and kind of pushing forward. We're seeing cantrips become more and more and more powerful, and seeing those martial characters kind of get left in the dust. And I'm sorry, but the new weapon proficiencies, the weapon mastery points in 2024 is just not equaling that out. That's just not working. So I think that we have to maybe look at what are we gonna do with cantrips in the future. What would the game look like if we didn't have any cantrips? It's actually, you know, not too different, I don't feel like. Sure, you can take away things like light, you can take away things like guidance, you can take away things like firebolt or vicious mockery, and those will hurt those caster classes in combat. But hey, that's why you have leveled spells, and you have proficiency with weapons as well outside of that. I'm not saying that a return to something like very, very old school D&D where the wizard's like, I'm a 1st level wizard, I have 1 spell slot, I use my spell, now I sit in the back with a crossbow all day. Maybe not quite to that degree do we get rid of cantrips, because I do think that that's frustrating for low level magic players. Where we are now is so far an overcorrection in the other direction, where we have, it's relatively easy for a first level character to walk out with 5+ cantrips. They can do all sorts of, you know, utility things. They have things like friends. The way that we treat friends is the way that I think we should treat things like mending, where friends is a very temporary effect, and they know it's done to them afterwards. Mending is a very temporary effect. People who are looking at the mended item should know that it's been mended and that that's a temporary fix and will go away. I think that the game would not be hurt that much if we did not have combat-oriented cantrips. Or if we did, we had cantrips that focused more on that other stuff, more on that, like, slowing speed, getting rid of reactions, doing things like that, rather than dealing just straight damage that most monsters are not going to have resistances to, compared to basic bludgeoning, slashing, and piercing. That there has to be some sort of cost for cantrips, because they're too powerful to just be a limitless resource, especially in combat. Well, thanks everybody. This was really great. Glory to the gods for always. And I'll see you guys next time. Alright, I think we're going to hit it back with a solo RPG next time, so stay tuned. And I'll see you guys next time. Alright? Bye.